So in the narrative lab, we've got narrative lab folks, we've got video game lab folks, and one piece of psychology that cross-cuts all of that is the research into nostalgia. And this semester, fall 2024, I wanted the group to take a slow, deep walk through this river that is nostalgia, not just media and nostalgia, but going back to the deeper social psyche of nostalgia. And so I discovered a few articles that I thought were key here. I hope you guys can hear me. There's a plumber with a reciprocating saw on my back porch. It's always something. Um, anyway, and I picked out this article and I thought it looked really good. And I have to say, after reading it, I'm just so impressed. I just think that this is an exemplary research article methodologically and especially perhaps from a theory perspective. So Andreas and I are both social psychologists. So just know if you're starting out in grad school, I became a social psychologist in 1997. So I've had a lot of time to practice. And sometimes when people say imposter syndrome or I don't feel up to it or whatever, I think it's not a fair comparison to compare yourself to anyone who's competent. And I'm just going to go out and say I'm competent, people. I am. Sometimes I'm incompetent and sometimes I'm stupid, but I am also competent. And I have been doing this since 1997, and I am a social psychologist, and I've had a long time to think about it. So it's, I mentioned I'm a yoga instructor and a meditation instructor, and one of the rules in yoga is to keep your eyes on your own mat. You can only really compare yourself to yourself. So having said that, you're going to think, I'm meaning this presentation is going to rock. I won't, but I will say that I find the article really interesting. And I think it's a nice basis for a lot that we could do. So nostalgia as a window to the intrinsic self. So if you crack open a book, Intro to Social Psych from the undergrad perspective, you will see that the self is one of the dozen or so concepts in social psychology. That might seem weird because social means more than one person and self is one person. But it's not weird because we believe that the self is a social construct. So what we do is comparative to other people. It involves other people in our lives. So if I think I know a lot about it, psychology, well, I know my own life story, so I know how long I've been doing it and all the things I've done. But I also know that because I've done it for that long compared to other people, I'm going to know a lot about it. If I still didn't know what it was, that'd be bad. I remember the night before I taught social psych for the first time, I was on the phone with a friend who is also teaching it for the first time, and we were like, what is social psychology? So that's where I was in the first year of grad school, just so you know. So what is this article, Baldwin et al.? What's it all about? That's the gist of what I'd like you to present if you're presenting a paper. I'll talk about this when I talk about how to do the author's notebook, but you want to look at the variables that they studied and what the relationships that they were predicting between those variables. And this is a mega monster paper. It has 7 studies in it, and that is very, very, very abnormal. So also it was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psych, which we social psychologists call JPSP. It's the ultimate social psych journal. It's got a very high rejection rate. So this paper, like I say, is very deeply theoretical. They are trying to create a theory that integrates a bunch of findings on the benefits of nostalgia. This is not a media article, even though they mention stories and specific stories. This is just social psych. It's the psychology of nostalgia. Why do we need an integrated theory? Because there are all these findings of why the experience of nostalgia is positive, but we don't understand why. We talk about theory, and theory could feel very intimidating. Theory is really answering why. Why would I expect the experience of nostalgia to be connected to feelings of well-being? By the way, I'm going to use the phrase experience of nostalgia, and they just use nostalgia. I'm just sharpening that in my head because they're talking about the experience of nostalgia. So when you feel nostalgic, you also feel a sense of well-being. So that's why I'm using that term. I'm using it for me. So I understand when I'm talking about this. So what positive findings are there about nostalgia? Research methods note, if they use the experimental design, then we can say that nostalgia causes certain outcomes. If they used a correlational design, we could say nostalgia connects with, predicts, is associated with other findings. This paper's from 9 years ago, and so there's been time for other stuff to come out. A theoretical paper is more likely to be a little bit further back in time because it's the basis for other research that follows. So what positive findings are associated with nostalgia? All of these that I have here plastered on the page. Well-being, social support, feeling loved, feeling secure, feeling social support, feeling life is meaningful, personal growth, self-esteem of multiple sorts, self-transcendence, social inclusion, lowered prejudice and stereotyping. Sounds like we all need to drink a bottle of nostalgia because it is amazing. And maybe that's why we're watching umpteen Marvel movies, because we just want to reconnect with all those people we know who Iron Man is, and we're just going to watch that again, you know? So I think all of this stuff is just dying to be applied to media, which of course it has been, but not as much as you might think. So I'm saying nostalgia, and it's an everyday word, and I'm sure we have all talked about it in our own lives at some point, but here are some definitions I pulled from the article. So they're saying, and I'm citing them, Baldwin et al., 2015, this is on page 128. What's nostalgia? It's a sentimental longing or affection for the past, said to be a universal emotion. So they're situating it with past, longing, and affection. They mention its connection to a return home. They raise the specter that some people have thought that nostalgia is pathological, like you don't want to be here, so you're thinking of some other time that you would rather be in. Is it pathological? Well, they did 7 studies, so I'm just going to give it to them. They have demonstrated that no, it's not pathological, and so have other people. Another definition, a sentimental yearning for the happiness of a former place or time. Nostalgia's primary characteristics include fond memories, personal meaning, social relationships, keepsakes, happiness, and childhood. Again, not with media, just generally. And nostalgia means a longing and a need to come home. Coming home can mean lots of things, but in this particular quote, Mario Jacobi says, you're coming home to selfhood from the foreign land of self-alienation. My current favorite definition of nostalgia I got when Josh Cohen and I went to the Pop Culture Association meeting and presented in late March or early April this year in Chicago. And we met Christine Thor there, who's a French-Canadian researcher and was doing media and nostalgia research similar to our own. I had this blissful moment where the fact that I minored in French and majored in psychology finally made sense, and I could read her paper in French. So I've posted the paper in French. You could Google translate it or other things, but I took notes on it and wrote some translations in my notes about it. And so here's one of my notes. This is just a direct translation. The concept of nostalgia was first used to qualify the painful feeling associated with displacement and missing home that no longer or never existed. Then more fundamentally to the desire to find a lost time, particularly that of childhood, and the nostalgic practice could also be constructive. So bittersweet desire to return home, and home can mean a lot of things. I will say Josh Cohen, in his reading for his dissertation, compiled, I think, 7 or 8 different types of nostalgia with media, such as the time in the story, such as watching Mad Men that's set in the 60s, the person or people you watch the show with, sitting on the sofa with your brother watching MASH, or also just the characters and the connection with the characters themselves, like parasocial relationships that can evoke nostalgia for them. So I'm going to say in my how to take notes thing that if they have a bunch of studies, no one is expecting you to tell us about them all. I usually say pick the first 1 or 2 are the main points, but I went ahead and just made this little table in my notes. I posted my notes online too. I wanted to know what the design was in every study and what the predictors and the criteria or the independent and dependent variables were. And basically the answer is everything they did worked. So if they predicted it, it did work, but you always want to key in on the variables. That's super important, and talk about the variables when you write with the same words every time. So they measured trait nostalgia. They also induced or caused nostalgia to happen, usually by telling people to think about events from their childhood. And they measured things related to the self and things related to well-being. So authentic self-expression, concern for what other people think, um, extrinsic self-focus, that's focus on the outside world and pressures and things like that. How accessible is your true self, your definition of who you really think you are, and well-being. And just some results. Like these are some different quotes. I wrote my notes and then I pulled things from my notes, and it was so easy to write this PowerPoint because I already had detailed notes. So some results. Nostalgia offers a window to the authentic self, which in turn orients current self-perceptions away from extrinsic concerns. And if you were to translate that from scientific language, you would say, when you feel nostalgia, you feel connected with who you truly are. And that tends to make you not worry about social pressure, who other people might want you to be. Reduce concerns for meeting external demands. When you are in a situation that people aren't letting you express your true self, the experience of nostalgia can help heal those emotions. And I put that this way: nostalgia buffers against threats to the true self, the intrinsic self. Intrinsic meaning inside, extrinsic outside. And they did demonstrate that trait nostalgia or dispositional nostalgia, the fact that you might, as a person, experience this more than average, is related to your expressing who you really are, your authentic self, and to your sense of well-being. So that is a very brief presentation, considering there were 7 studies, and I certainly could have gone through a bunch of other stuff that I did not go through.